Have you ever wondered who the person behind the mask truly is? For Abby, a woman who feels this electrifying kiss with a stranger wasn't an escape. It was a point of no return. Because the man behind the mask wasn't a prince. He was Connor Moretti, the ruthless king of the city's criminal underworld. And he doesn't just let her go. He decides she belongs to him, pulling her into his world of danger, power, and dark luxury. This is the story of how a single kiss can seal your fate. A story about a woman who finds her power in the most dangerous of places, and a king who finds his heart in the one person he should never have touched. So get comfortable, and let's begin. Comment with a mask emoji if you're ready to see what lies behind the mask, and subscribe for more tales of forbidden love and dangerous romance. Prepare for a story that asks, what happens when the most dangerous man in the city is the only one who can make you feel truly safe? It's a story of passion, power, and a love so intense it could conquer an empire, or burn it all to the ground. The champagne in Abby's glass had long gone warm. She held it more as a prop than for pleasure, a crystal shield against the suffocating opulence that surrounded her. The Hartwell Foundation's masquerade ball was the pinnacle of the New York social season, a river of designer gowns and bespoke tuxedos flowing through a penthouse at the top of the world. From her position near the balcony doors, Abby watched the light fracture through crystal chandeliers, scattering dancing diamonds over faces hidden behind feathers and filigree. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the low hum of powerful conversations, the sound of deals being made and reputations being unmade with polished smiles. She felt the fabric of her dress, alone from her boss, brush against her skin. It felt foreign, like wearing someone else's costume. And, in a way, it was. Her silver mask, delicate and cool against her face, was her only real possession that night. A small piece of anonymity in a sea of familiar faces. Her fingers traced the cold metal, a nervous habit she couldn't suppress. Just one more hour, she told herself, the phrase becoming a silent mantra. Tired of the scene, of the pretense, she slipped out onto the balcony. The cool October night air was an instant relief, soothing the heat that had been rising up her neck. The roar of the city below was a distant murmur, an earthy counterpoint to the ethereal classical music drifting from inside. She leaned against the cold marble balustrade, the vast expanse of Manhattan's lights unfolding before her like a captured galaxy of stars. Here the noise was honest. Here she could breathe. They promise freedom, don't they? The voice came from the shadows to her right. It was deep and calm, with a texture that seemed to vibrate in the air. Abby turned, her heart giving a single hard jolt in her chest. A man stood there, leaning against the stone wall, almost invisible in the darkness. He was tall, his silhouette impeccably cut in a dark tuxedo. His mask was simple, a piece of smooth onyx that covered his eyes, but couldn't hide the hard line of his jaw or the curve of his lips. He hadn't moved, yet his presence seemed to fill the entire balcony, a stillness that was more commanding than any motion. The masks, he clarified, his head tilting slightly in her direction. They promise you can be anyone, but that's a lie. Abby felt a shiver trace its way up her arms, and it wasn't from the cold. Most men would have used a cheap pickup line. He offered philosophy. And what's the truth? She heard herself ask, her voice steadier than she felt. He finally pushed away from the wall, taking a step into the light. His leather shoes gleamed, the only sound in the silence between them. The truth is that a mask doesn't hide who you are. It just gives you the courage to show it. His eyes, hidden by the mask, seemed to bore into hers. She felt a strange sensation of being seen, truly seen, in a way that left her feeling naked, despite the layers of silk and the silver mask. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the fine weave of his white shirt, close enough that she could feel a current of warmth emanating from him. "And what is your mask showing tonight?" he asked, his tone low and intimate. "That I'd rather be anywhere else," Abby answered with a reckless honesty born from the night's anonymity. A slow smile touched his lips, a smile that didn't reach the chilling intensity she felt coming from behind the mask. Honesty. How refreshing. He moved to the balustrade beside her, his arm brushing hers for a fraction of a second. The brief contact sent an electric shock through her, making her fingers tingle. "My name is Connor," he said, his voice a murmur meant only for her. Abby. The name felt thin and insignificant compared to his. They stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the city. But it wasn't an awkward silence. It was charged, full of unsaid words. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her profile. Daring a glance, she looked at him. The city light caught the sharp angle of his face, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. She caught a faint scent, not of cologne, but of something more complex. Ozone, like impending rain, and a hint of whiskey. "You don't belong here, Abby," he stated, not a question. "Is it that obvious?" she murmured, tucking a stray strand of hair that had escaped its pins. A needless gesture that betrayed her nerves. "Not to them," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the loud party inside. "They only see the dress and the mask. But your eyes, even from behind all that metal, they aren't impressed. They're watching, analyzing." He turned to face her fully. "You see the cracks in the facade." Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one had ever described her so accurately. She had always been the observer, the person in the corner who noticed the details everyone else missed. And this stranger, this man from the shadows, had read her in a matter of minutes. The music inside shifted, melting into a slow, haunting waltz. He held out his hand. It wasn't a gallant invitation. It was a quiet expectation. "Dance with me." "This is insane," the sane part of her brain thought. "You know nothing about him." But her body wasn't listening. Her hand, as if with a will of its own, found his. His fingers were strong and warm, enveloping hers with a certainty that silenced all her fears. He led her back inside. The crowd seemed to part for them, or maybe it just felt that way. The moment he pulled her close on the dance floor, the world fell away. His hand found the small of her back. Not a possessive grip, but a firm, grounding pressure that made her hold her breath. His other hand held hers, their fingers lacing together. They moved as one, her body following his effortlessly. She tilted her head back to look up at him, at the onyx mask that made him a complete mystery. "Why me?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. His head lowered, his lips dangerously close to her ear. His warm breath on her skin made her shiver. "Because in a room full of copies," he murmured, his voice a rough caress. "You are the only original." His grip on her waist tightened slightly, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. His scent surrounded her, intoxicating. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against hers, or perhaps it was both of them, pounding in unison. Time seemed to slow, to stretch. Every step of the waltz, every glance, every breath was charged with a tension that was almost unbearable. The music came to an end, but they didn't part. They stood motionless in the middle of the dance floor, wrapped in their own universe. She could feel the curious stares on them, but she didn't care. Nothing mattered except the man holding her. He lifted his hand, and with one finger, traced the line of her jaw, a touch so light it was almost a suggestion. His thumb brushed over her bottom lip, and a soft gasp caught in her throat. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his voice tight with a restrained emotion. She didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she leaned into him, a barely perceptible movement, a surrender. It was enough. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a polite, romantic kiss. It wasn't hesitant or gentle. It was a kiss of discovery, of recognition. It was possessive and hungry, as if he'd been waiting for this moment for an eternity. His lips were firm and demanding, moving over hers with a certainty that left her weak. Her mind went blessedly, terrifyingly blank. All the noise, all the lights, all the people disappeared. Her entire universe was reduced to the pressure of his mouth, the taste of him whiskey and something darker, more dangerous, more addictive. One of his hands moved up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her in place. Not that she was planning on going anywhere. When he finally pulled back, she was breathless, her lips tingling. She opened her eyes, feeling disoriented, as if waking from a vivid dream. He was still holding her close, and from behind the mask, she felt the intensity of his gaze burning through her. The clock somewhere began to strike midnight, the signal, the end of anonymity. A murmur went through the room as people began removing their masks with laughter and applause. Abby felt a sudden panic. She didn't want the magic to end. Connor seemed to sense her hesitation. He leaned in and brushed his lips against hers one more time, a ghost of a kiss that promised more. "I hope fate finds us again, Abby." And with that, he released her. He turned, and before she could say a word, before she could ask for his full name, before she could see the face behind the onyx mask, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd as if he'd never been there at all. Abby stood frozen, her heart pounding a wild rhythm in her chest, his touch still burning on her skin. She lifted her fingers to her lips, the taste of him still lingering on her mouth. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, but she had never felt so completely alone. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty that settled deep in her soul, that the man who had just kissed her was not someone you meet by chance. He was someone that fate, or something much darker, puts in your path. The morning light that filtered through Abby's bedroom window was pale and unforgiving. It revealed the imperfections of her small apartment, the slight peeling of paint near the ceiling, the stack of books on the chair she kept promising herself she would organize, the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a world a million miles away from the opulent penthouse and crystal glitter of the night before. Abby groaned and buried her face in her pillow, the familiar scent of cotton and lavender replacing the phantom aroma of whiskey and rain that had haunted her dreams. The silver silk gown was thrown over a chair, looking like a sequined ghost in the daylight. The sight of it made a hot blush creep up her neck, a mixture of embarrassment and a deeper, vibrating thrill she didn't dare name. She sat up in bed, the rough sheets scratching against her bare skin, and brought her fingers to her lips. They still felt tender, swollen. She could almost feel the pressure of his, the way he'd held her as if she were something precious, something he had a right to possess. It was the mask, she told herself, the voice of reason trying desperately to take over. It was the champagne. It was one night of madness, a fluke. She repeated the words in her mind, but they rang hollow, flimsy lies against the undeniable truth her body remembered. Her heart hadn't hammered like that because of champagne. Her breath hadn't caught in her throat because of the mask. It was him, Connor. A man with no face, just a voice and a touch that had completely undone her. Getting up was an act of will. Every movement felt slow, heavy. In the shower, she scrubbed her skin until it was red, trying to wash away the feeling of his fingers on her back, the heat of his hand in her hair. But it was useless. The memory was branded on her, a phantom impression that refused to fade. The following weeks were an exercise in forced denial. Life resumed its monotonous, predictable rhythm. She returned the dress to her boss, Mrs. Davenport, a woman whose existence was a series of luncheons, committee meetings, and dress fittings. Abby was her shadow, organizing her schedule, answering her emails, ensuring the delicate ecosystem of her social life remained in perfect balance. It was a job that required the very skill for observation Connor had noted in her, the ability to see the unspoken tensions in a room, to anticipate her boss's needs before she even voiced them. She was good at it. But now, the work felt emptier than ever. During the day, she could manage to push the memory of the ball into a dark corner of her mind. But at night, he returned. In quiet moments, she would find herself staring into space, her mind replaying every second on the balcony, every step of the waltz. The sound of his voice echoed in her memory. "You are the only original." She hated herself for the weakness, for the way her pulse quickened at the simple recollection. He was a dream, a one-night fantasy. Men like him didn't exist in her world, and even if they did, they didn't look at women like her. On a dreary Saturday, Almost a month after the ball, Abby sought refuge in her only true sanctuary, the Met. She had always loved the quiet of museums, the way art could transport her to other times, other lives. She wandered through the European galleries, letting the beauty of the paintings soothe the restlessness in her soul. She stopped before a Caravaggio, captivated by the dramatic play of light and shadow, the chiaroscuro, beauty emerging from darkness. It felt fitting. She was so absorbed in the work, tracing the agony on a saint's face with her eyes, that she didn't notice the shift in the room's atmosphere. It was subtle at first, a drop in temperature, a stillness that settled over the usual murmur of visitors. The energy in the room had shifted, coalescing to a single point. She felt a prickle on the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly she turned, and the air left her lungs in a silent rush. Across the room there he was. There was no mask, but there was no doubt. It was the same imposing height, the same broad shoulders under a perfectly tailored gray suit that probably cost more than her yearly rent. His hair was dark, cut short, and his face, it was even more arresting than her imagination had dared to conjure. It was a face of hard angles and classical beauty, like a Roman statue brought to life. A strong jaw, lips she knew all too well, and eyes. Dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through her, stripping away all her secrets. He wasn't looking at her. He was standing with two other men, listening to them with a lethal stillness. Their deference was palpable. They leaned in toward him, their voices low, while he stood perfectly motionless, an island of calm power. People around them gave them a wide berth, an invisible circle of respect or fear. Abby's heart began to pound a wild, painful rhythm against her ribs. It's him. It's impossible. A couple walked past her, whispering. "That's Connor Moretti," the woman murmured to her husband. "They say he practically owns half the city's real estate." Connor Moretti. The name echoed in Abby's head. A name for the face, for the voice, for the kiss. As if he felt the weight of her stare, his head turned. His dark eyes swept the room and landed on her. For a split second, the entire world stopped. The buzz of the gallery faded. The paintings washed out. There was only the crackling connection between them, an invisible current stretching across the space. There was no smile on his lips, but she saw it. A glint in his eyes. Recognition. And something else. Triumph. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. "I found you." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Abby's shock. She turned abruptly, her body moving on instinct. She didn't walk, she practically fled, pushing past statues and tourists, the sound of her own footsteps muffled by the blood roaring in her ears. She didn't stop until she was outside on the cold pavement, the city air filling her aching lungs. She hailed a cab, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open the door. The entire ride back to her apartment, she kept looking out the rear window, half expecting to see a black car following. It was paranoia. It had to be. Locked in her apartment, she leaned against the door, her heart still racing. Connor Moretti. She scrambled for her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The first search results were clean, corporate. Moretti Holdings. Articles on real estate development, donations to charities, pictures of him at galas, always impeccable, always remote. A reclusive billionaire businessman. But Abby knew how to dig. She added search terms. Moretti family, history, rumors. And then, the facade began to crack. She found old news clippings, obscure blog posts, true crime forums. The words leaped off the screen. Syndicate, Familia, Untouchable, the New York underworld. The story of a dynasty built on secrets and power, passed from father to son. A family whose influence stretched far beyond the real estate market. The blood drained from her face. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. The man who had kissed her with such passion. The man whose voice haunted her. He wasn't a fairy tale prince. He was something out of a nightmare. A king, yes, but of a kingdom of shadows. She slammed the laptop shut, her body trembling. "Stay away from him," her mind screamed. "Forget that night. Forget you saw him today." At that exact moment, her cell phone, forgotten on the kitchen counter, buzzed. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silence of her apartment. She stared at the screen. Blocked number. Her thumb hovered over the reject button. It was stupid to answer. Dangerously stupid. But she couldn't stop herself. Her hand shaking brought the phone to her ear. She said nothing. Just the sound of her own ragged breath filled the line. For a long moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then his voice came, the same calm, deep texture that was seared into her memory. It wasn't loud, but it filled every inch of her apartment, surrounding her. "Fate, it seems, Abby," he said slowly, "is impatient." The line went dead. Abby stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, the echo of his words reverberating in her soul. The game, she realized with a breathtaking, soul-crushing terror, had only just begun, and she had no idea what the rules were. Connor's voice over the phone was like a key turning a lock inside Abby. Something she'd tried to keep contained, the fear, the excitement, the memory of that night was suddenly released, flooding her. She ended the call, her fingers stiff, and tossed the phone onto the sofa as if it had burned her hand. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. She paced her small apartment, the worn rug muffling her frantic footsteps. Her heart was beating a frantic double time, one beat of terror, the other of a dark, pulsing adrenaline she hated herself for feeling. How did he get my number? The question circled in her mind, but it was useless. A man like Connor Moretti didn't encounter obstacles. He removed them. The thought of his unseen influence, his tentacles reaching into her private life, was profoundly unsettling. She felt exposed, like a butterfly pinned under a collector's glass. In the days that followed, Abby lived in a state of high alert. Every black car that drove down her street made her stomach clench. Every time her phone rang from an unknown number, she held her breath. But there were no more calls, no messages. His silence was almost worse than contact. It was a form of control, leaving her suspended in a state of nervous anticipation, making her think of him in every quiet moment. Her friend Emma, an artist who lived in a chaotic Brooklyn loft, noticed the change in her immediately. They met for coffee on a rainy Saturday afternoon, the scent of roasting beans and the soft sound of background jazz barely registering with Abby. "You're a million miles away," Emma said, her sharp eyes studying Abby's face over the rim of her ceramic mug. "And you look like you haven't slept in a week. What's going on?" Abby hesitated. How could she possibly explain? "I kissed a stranger, and he turned out to be the king of the New York underworld, and now I think he's silently haunting me." It sounded like the plot of a bad movie. Instead, she shrugged, a weak gesture. "Just stress at work. Mrs. Davenport is planning another charity gala." Emma narrowed her eyes. She knew Abby too well. "This isn't work stress. This is something else. You're scared." Abby opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She just sighed, the sound a mixture of exhaustion and defeat. She told Emma about the ball, about the masked man, the dance, the kiss. She described the electricity, the connection. Emma's face lit up with a vicarious grin. "Abby, that's incredibly romantic. Who was he?" The knot of ice returned to Abby's stomach. "That's the problem, Em. I saw him again. His name is Connor Moretti." Emma frowned, the name not registering. "I looked him up," Abby continued, her voice dropping to a strained whisper. He's not just a businessman. His family, they're connected to things." Understanding slowly dawned on Emma's face, erasing her smile. The romance of it all evaporated, replaced by a worrying chill. "Oh, Abby. No, not that kind of things, right?" Abby just stared down at her hands, which were twisting a paper napkin into shreds. That silence was answer enough. "Stay away from him," Emma said, her voice suddenly fierce. "I'm serious. People like him bring nothing but trouble. This isn't a romance, it's dangerous." "I know," Abby whispered. I will. But it was a promise she wasn't sure she could keep, because Connor Moretti didn't seem like the kind of man you stayed away from. He was the kind who decided if he would stay close to you. Proof of that arrived the next morning, a Monday. As Abby came down to her building's lobby, a delivery man was waiting for her, holding a long, elegant box. Abigail Parker? He asked. She nodded, confused. This is for you. There was no card, no return address. Inside the box, nestled in tissue paper, were 12 rare orchids, a shade of purple so dark it was almost black. They were otherworldly in their beauty, perfect and a little menacing. There was no note. There didn't need to be. Only one man knew of her existence on that level. The flowers weren't an apology or a declaration. They were a statement. I know where you live. She left them on her kitchen counter, unable to throw them out, but unable to bring herself to find a vase for them either. They sat there, a dark, exotic stain in her ordinary kitchen, a reminder of the world intruding on her own. 2 days later at work, Mrs. Davenport called her into her office. Abby, dear, the most extraordinary thing has happened. We've just received an anonymous donation for the gala. A rather staggering amount. She showed Abby the computer screen. Abby felt the blood run cold. The sum was enough to fund the entire charity project for a year. And the donor had only one request. Mrs. Davenport continued, beaming. That a Ms. Abigail Parker be given 2 tickets to the Philharmonic on Friday, as a thank you for her hard work. Abby stared at the screen, then at her boss. Her mouth was dry. The concert. The night of the ball, while looking out over the city, she had casually mentioned how she'd always wanted to go to the Philharmonic, but could never afford it. It was a passing remark, a small confession in the dark. And he had remembered. The gesture was so calculated, so perfectly executed, it took her breath away. It wasn't a gift to her, but to the charity, making it impossible for her to refuse. It was a demonstration of his power, his memory, his unwavering focus on her. He wasn't pursuing her with threats, but with grand, gentle gestures that were somehow even more terrifying. What does he want? She wondered, the question echoing in every quiet moment. Her answer came that Friday. Against her better judgment, driven by a morbid curiosity that outweighed her fear, she went to the concert. Alone. She wore a simple black dress, feeling desperately out of place among the wealthy patrons at Lincoln Center. Her seat was perfect. Center orchestra. The music swelled around her, a magnificent wave of sound that should have soothed her soul. But she couldn't relax. She felt as if every note was being played just for her, part of a larger piece he was orchestrating. During the intermission, rather than joining the crush of the crowd in the main lobby, she found a small, less crowded bar upstairs. She ordered a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly as she took the glass. She stared out the window, at the illuminated fountain in the plaza below. Beethoven has a way of putting the world into perspective, don't you think? The same voice. Deep. Calm. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. She felt him approach, a solid, warm presence that altered the air around her. He stopped beside her. Not too close, but enough that her field of vision was filled with him. He wore a dark suit, no tie, the collar of his white shirt unbuttoned. Casual, yet he exuded an authority no tuxedo ever could. "How did you know I'd come?" she asked, her voice low, almost a breath. "I didn't," he replied. "I hoped." She finally turned to face him. Up close, he was overwhelming. There were small lines around his dark eyes, suggesting he didn't smile often. There was a thin, almost invisible scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a reminder that his world was real, not just whispers and news articles. "The flowers were beautiful," she said, the sentence sounding like an accusation. "The donation was generous." "I'm a generous man," he said, a faint hint of irony in his voice. His eyes scanned her face, lingering on her lips before meeting her eyes again. The intensity of his gaze made her heart stumble. "I believe in investing in things of beauty and value." The implication hung in the air between them, so palpable she could almost touch it. "I'm not one of your investments, Mr. Moretti," she said, forcing a coolness she didn't feel. Please, he said, the corner of his lips twitching in the first hint of a smile she'd seen. It transformed him, softening the hard edges of his face, making him dangerously charming. Connor, and no, you aren't an investment, Abby. You're an anomaly, and I'm fascinated by anomalies. He took a step closer. His scent, that same smell of rain, and something clean and masculine enveloped her, clouding her thoughts. The bell chimed, signaling the end of the intermission. The spell was broken. I have to go, she said, turning to leave. His hand shot out, catching her wrist. It wasn't a harsh grip, but his fingers wrapped around her skin with a heat and a certainty that stopped her cold. The contact was electric, sending a jolt straight to the core of her being. Have dinner with me, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his eyes. She saw the determination there, an iron will that was not used to being denied. The sane part of her brain, the voice that sounded a lot like Emma, was screaming at her to run. But then she looked deeper, past the authority, past the power. And for a fleeting instant, she saw something else. The same loneliness she had sensed on the balcony of the ball. A hunger that had nothing to do with power or business. It was something primal, human. And frighteningly, she felt an echo of it within herself. Tomorrow night, he continued, his voice softer now. A car will pick you up at 8. Please don't make me wait. He released her wrist, but the heat of his fingers remained, a brand on her skin. He took a step back, giving her space to breathe. And then he turned and was gone, melting into the crowd as effortlessly as he had at the ball. Abby stood motionless, the sound of the orchestra tuning their instruments a distant noise. She should be scared. She was. But beneath the fear, there was something else. A dangerous spark of curiosity, a fatal pull toward the darkness she saw in him. She knew she should say no, but as she walked back to her seat, the music beginning to rise around her, she already knew the answer she would give. Abby spent the next 24 hours in a state of civil war. One part of her, the logical and terrified part, drew up a mental list of all the reasons she should simply not be there when the car arrived. The shadowy headlines, the whispered reputation, the look in Emma's eyes. Every item on the list was a red flag, a flashing stop sign in her mind. She was an ordinary girl with a rented apartment and bills to pay. He was the heir to a dark empire, a man whose life was a labyrinth of secrets she couldn't even begin to imagine. The intersection of their worlds was a dangerous place, and she knew it. But there was another part of her, a part she barely recognized, a part that was tired of the safe monotony of her life, a part that remembered the feeling of being truly seen from behind a mask, that craved the adrenaline of his touch, that was helplessly drawn to the complexity she sensed in him. This part whispered that the greatest threat wasn't the danger he posed, but the prospect of going back to a life where she would never feel that intensity again. It was madness. It was self-destructive. And yet, it was the voice that was winning. At 7:50 the next evening, she stood in front of her full-length mirror, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had chosen her best dress, a simple dark blue velvet sheath that hugged her curves without being revealing. It was the most elegant thing she owned. On Connor, it would look plain. She'd swept her hair up into a low chignon, leaving a few tendrils loose to frame her face. The makeup was minimal, just enough to hide the dark circles from her sleepless night. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was trying to arm herself with whatever confidence she could find. Promptly at 8, her intercom buzzed. The doorman's voice was formal. "Miss Parker, your car has arrived." Riding down in the elevator, she felt the cool metal of the handrail under her sweating palm. This was real. She was actually doing this. When the doors opened, a man in a black suit and a discreet earpiece was waiting for her in the lobby. He was tall and impassive, the kind of man who was built to be both invisible and intimidating. He inclined his head respectfully. "Miss Parker, this way, please." The car was not a flashy limousine. It was a black sedan, sleek and understated, with tinted windows that made it impossible to see inside. The driver opened the door for her. The interior was a sanctuary of black leather and silence. The windows seemed soundproof, instantly insulating her from the city's noise. The car slid into traffic with an unnatural smoothness. She didn't ask where they were going. It felt pointless. She was in Connor's world now, and he dictated the destination. They drove for about 20 minutes, heading to a part of the city she didn't recognize, a neighborhood of old warehouses and cobblestone streets near the river. The car pulled up to an anonymous metal door in a windowless brick wall. For a panicked moment, she thought she'd made a terrible mistake. But then the driver opened her door and led her to the metal entrance, which slid open silently before he even touched it. What was inside made her stop, her breath catching in her throat. It was like stepping into a secret garden. The space opened up into an inner courtyard, surrounded by ivy-covered brick walls and lit by strings of warm lights. In the center, under a massive magnolia tree, was a single table set for two. The air smelled of damp earth, night-blooming flowers, and the briny scent of the nearby river. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly unexpected. And then she saw him. Connor was standing near the table, watching her approach. He wasn't in a suit. He wore dark trousers and a white linen shirt, the long sleeves rolled up to his forearms. The informality made him somehow more imposing. Without the armor of his suits, she could see the power in his shoulders, the way he held himself with a predatory ease. "Abby," he said, his voice wrapping around her in the cool night air. "I'm glad you came." "Where are we?" she asked, her voice a little shaky as she took in the surroundings. "A place from my past," he answered vaguely. "One of my grandfather's first warehouses. I kept it for sentimental reasons." He pulled out her chair, a gesture of courtesy that seemed at odds with the intensity in his eyes. As she sat, his fingers brushed her bare shoulders. The touch was brief, but it sent a wave of heat across her skin. He sat across from her. The table was small enough for intimacy, but wide enough that she didn't feel trapped. Everything, she realized, was deliberate. A waiter appeared silently, poured wine, and vanished just as quickly. The silence stretched between them, but it was different from the silence on the balcony. This one was charged with unasked questions. "Why me, Connor?" she finally asked, cutting right to the point. Her own boldness surprised her. He swirled the wine in his glass, his dark eyes fixed on the red liquid. "I ask myself the same question," he admitted. And when his eyes met hers, there was an honesty in them that disarmed her. "I spend my days surrounded by people who want something from me. My money, my influence, my name. They wear masks of respect and loyalty, but I see the greed underneath. It's tiresome." He paused, taking a sip of wine. "That night, on the balcony, I looked at you, and I saw none of that. I saw someone who was just as tired of the pretense as I was. Someone real." He leaned forward, the soft light casting shadows across his face, accentuating its bone structure. "My world isn't simple, Abby. It's dark and complicated. The things you've read about my family, much of it is true." The direct confession shocked her. She had expected denials, euphemisms, not this brutal acceptance. "I'm telling you this," he continued, his voice lowering, "because what I felt with you on that balcony was the most real thing I've experienced in years, and I'm not willing to let it go." Her heart was pounding, a steady drum against her ribs. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was being overshadowed by something else. The raw vulnerability in his confession, the way he looked at her as if she were an oasis in the desert of his life. The food arrived, course after course of exquisite Italian cuisine, but Abby barely tasted it. She was too focused on him, absorbing his every word, every micro-expression. He spoke of his grandfather, the man who built the empire from nothing, describing him with a mixture of reverence and regret. He didn't talk about the business, not explicitly, but she could read between the lines. She could feel the weight of the legacy he carried on his shoulders. She found herself opening up too, telling him about her love for art, her abandoned dreams of becoming a curator, the way she felt trapped in her current life. He listened to her with an attention that was almost physical, his eyes never leaving hers. He asked questions, insightful questions that made her think, that made her feel seen and understood in a way no one ever had before. When they had finished eating, the night air had grown cooler. Connor stood and held out his hand to her. "Come." She took his hand without hesitation. Their fingers laced together, a natural, perfect fit. He led her away from the table, to a darker corner of the courtyard, where a wooden door led out onto a short pier on the river. The sound of the water lapping gently against the wood was soothing. The lights of the city across the river seemed distant, like another world. He stopped at the end of the pier, turning to face her. The river breeze tousled his hair, and in the dim light, he looked younger, less the dawn and more the man. "I'll understand if you walk away now," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the sound of the water. "I won't stop you. You can leave and I will never bother you again." His eyes were pleading with her to stay. It was her choice, the safe, known path, or the leap into the dark and dangerous unknown with this man. She looked at his face, at the loneliness in his eyes that mirrored her own. She thought of her gray, predictable life, and she knew the answer. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. She raised her hand and touched his face, the stubble of his beard scratching her palm in a delicious contrast. He flinched at her touch, closing his eyes for a moment, like a man dying of thirst receiving the first drop of water. "I don't think I can," she whispered, the truth of the statement resonating in her own heart. His eyes snapped open. The hunger in them stole her breath. He said nothing. He simply lowered his head and kissed her. This kiss was different from the others. It didn't have the feverish urgency of the ball or the hesitant promise of the concert. This was a kiss of acceptance, slow, deep, and filled with a tenderness she hadn't expected. His lips moved over hers with a reverence that made her feel cherished. He drew her close, one hand at her back, the other cupping her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. It was a kiss that spoke of relief, of finding something you didn't even know you were searching for. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart under her cheek. She inhaled his scent, feeling safe in a way that defied all logic. She had made her choice. She had jumped. And as he held her there in the dark, the river flowing silently beside them, she knew with a terrifying, thrilling certainty that there was no going back. The ride back to Abby's apartment that night was silent and charged. The same black sedan, the same impassive driver. But this time, Connor was beside her, his thigh inches from hers on the leather back seat. The small space seemed to hum with his energy, with the aftershock of the kiss on the pier. Abby could feel the skin where he'd touched her tingling, a hyper-awareness of his proximity. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, feel the rhythm of his breathing. He didn't touch her during the drive, but his presence was a weight, a brand beside her. When the car pulled up to her building, she expected him to drop her off at the curb. Instead, he got out with her. Under the sallow yellow light of the entryway, his dark eyes scanned her face, as if memorizing every detail. "I'm not coming up," he said, his voice low. "Not tonight." There was an implicit promise in those words. There will be other nights. A relief washed through Abby, mingled with a pang of something she could only identify as disappointment. It was too soon, too fast. He lifted his hand and brushed his thumb over her bottom lip, an echo of their kiss. "Sleep well, Abby." He waited until she was safely inside the lobby before he turned, got back into the car, and disappeared into the night. Abby rode up to her apartment in a dreamlike daze. She shed the velvet dress and let it pool on the floor, a dark blue puddle on the pale wood. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted in her eyes. There was a brightness, a spark of danger that hadn't been there before. She fell into a deep and dreamless sleep, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day. Their romance blossomed in the days and weeks that followed, in a carefully orchestrated cocoon of secrecy. Connor was a master of discretion. There were no dinners at trendy restaurants or public appearances. Instead, he created a private world for them. Dates in closed art galleries after hours, where they could walk hand in hand in front of masterpieces, the only two souls in the silent halls. Late-night picnics in the botanical garden, long after the gates had been locked to the public. He took her to small, family-owned restaurants in neighborhoods where no one would recognize him as Connor Moretti, the Don, but just as a man in love with a woman. In their moments together, he was different from the man she'd researched. He was thoughtful, curious about her mind. He listened to her with an intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. He remembered every little thing she said, her favorite painter, the book she was reading, a childhood memory she shared. He made her laugh, a sound that felt like it had been dormant inside her for years. And the physical pull between them was a constant undercurrent to every interaction, a lingering touch of his hand on hers, the way he'd place his hand on the small of her back to guide her through a door, stolen kisses in dark corners, slow and deep, that left her dizzy and aching for more. He was patient, never pushing her, but the tension built between them, a delicious promise of what was to come. But his world didn't disappear. It was always there, a shadow at the periphery. It was in the silent drivers and the bodyguards who kept a respectful but ever-present distance. It was in the way Connor's phone would ring at odd hours, and he would step away to take the call, his voice dropping to a cool, authoritative tone that sent a shiver down her spine. When he returned, the hardness in his eyes would take a few moments to soften as he looked at her. She never asked. She knew she wasn't supposed to. It was the unspoken rule of their relationship. His world was his, and their world was this sanctuary he had built for them. It was Emma who first threw a stone into the calm water of their bubble. "I barely see you anymore," Emma said, perched on Abby's sofa, a cup of untouched tea in her hands. "And when I do, you're different. You're happy, which is great. But there's this shadow." Abby winced internally. She had been avoiding Emma, not intentionally, but because it was hard to reconcile her time with Connor and the friendship that represented her normal life. "I've just been busy." "With him," Emma stated, not a question. "Abby, you're falling for him, aren't you?" The word hung in the air. Falling. Abby hadn't dared to form the thought, but the moment Emma said it, she knew it was true. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. She loved the way he made her feel alive, but she was deathly afraid of the world he belonged to. "Emma, it's complicated," Abby finally whispered. "Complicated?" Emma scoffed, her fear for her friend making her voice sharp. "Abby, last night on the news there was a story. A building exploded in Red Hook. The police are calling it a gas leak, but the blogs, the people who pay attention, they're saying it was a warehouse belonging to a rival family of the Morettis." The tea in Abby's stomach turned to ice. She hadn't seen the news. Last night, she and Connor had been at the planetarium, lying on their backs in the dark, holding hands as the synthetic stars wheeled overhead. He had been calm, tender. It was impossible to imagine that man being connected to explosions and violence. "That has nothing to do with him," Abby said, the denial sounding weak even to her own ears. "Doesn't it?" Emma stood, pacing. "He's showing you one side of himself, Abby. The side he wants you to see. But there's another side. The side that runs an empire. Do you really think you build an empire with picnics and poetry?" Emma's words were cruel, but they were born of love. They pierced through Abby's bubble of denial. Later that night, alone in her bed, the doubts began to creep in. The hardness she saw in his eyes at times. The secret phone calls. They were cracks in the perfect facade he presented to her. The threat, when it came, wasn't an explosion. It was much subtler and far more personal. She was leaving her building one afternoon when a man stopped her on the sidewalk. He was older, well-dressed in an expensive overcoat, his gray hair slicked back. There was an air of old-world power about him, but his eyes were cold, like chips of ice. "Miss Parker?" he said, his voice smooth and polished. "Yes," Abby answered, wary. My name is Silvio Falcone. I was a business associate of Connor's father. The name Falcone rang an alarm bell in Abby's mind. It was the name of the rival family she'd read about online. The family whose warehouse had exploded. A cold dread slid down her spine. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think you do, Falcone said, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. I just wanted to offer a friendly piece of advice. Connor is playing a dangerous game. He's breaking with tradition. And he's showing a weakness his father never had. His cold eyes bored into hers. You. He's parading you, his normal little thing, around like a trophy. But trophies can be broken. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He hasn't told you how his mother died, has he? An outsider, just like you. She never understood the rules. One day she was in the wrong place, at the wrong time. A car accident. So tragic. The air left Abby's lungs. Stay away from him, little girl, Falcone finished, for your own good. He turned and got into a car that had pulled up silently at the curb, and was gone. Abby stood on the sidewalk, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The city noise faded to a distant hum. Trophies can be broken. His mother. A car accident. The bubble had burst. The beautiful, secret fantasy she and Connor had built was invaded by the ugly, brutal reality of his world. It wasn't about gallery dates and stolen kisses anymore. It was about life and death. That night, when Connor called, his voice warm and familiar, she couldn't hide the tremble in hers. Abby, what's wrong? He asked immediately, his sharp perception catching the shift in her. We need to talk, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Not over the phone. In person. There was a pause. When he spoke again, all the warmth was gone from his voice, replaced by cold steel. Where are you? Home. Don't move, I'm coming. The line went dead. Abby knew the confrontation was inevitable. She would have to confront him with Falcone's words. She would have to look into the eyes of the man she was falling in love with, and ask him about the darkness she had tried so hard to ignore. And she was terrified of what he might say. The sound of the intercom buzzer cut through the tense silence of Abby's apartment 20 minutes later. The speed with which Connor had arrived told her more than any words. He had crossed the city, breaking every speed limit, driven by the note of fear in her voice. She pressed the button to unlock the lobby door, her hand cold and clammy. Every second that passed as she waited for him to ride the elevator up was torture. She paced the living room, her heart a block of ice in her chest, the echoes of Falcone's words ricocheting in her mind. Trophies can be broken. His mother. The knock on her door wasn't loud, but it was firm, authoritative. She took a deep, steadying breath and opened it. Connor stood in the hallway, and the sight of him almost made her recoil. This was not the man who took her on late-night picnics. The calm, controlled facade was gone, replaced by a contained storm. His shoulders were tense under his black leather jacket, his jaw was clenched. And his eyes were dark and dangerous, sweeping over her from head to toe in a split second, searching for any sign of physical harm. Are you all right? He asked, his voice a low, rough growl. She could only nod, unable to speak. He stepped into the apartment, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a vault sealing shut. He didn't move further into the room. He just stood there, filling the small space with a volatile energy that made the air hum. What happened? He demanded. Talk to me, Abby. She found her voice, though it trembled. A man spoke to me today, outside the building. He said his name was Silvio Falcone. The change in Connor was instant and terrifying. A glacial fury radiated from him, so potent the air in the room seemed to chill by several degrees. His fists clenched at his sides. The name Falcone hung between them, weighted with generations of bad blood. What did he say to you? The question was delivered with a deadly calm that was somehow more frightening than if he had shouted. Tears welled in Abby's eyes, a mixture of fear and the sting of betrayal she felt, even though it wasn't his fault. He called me your weakness, your trophy. Her voice broke. He told me about your mother, Connor. He said she was an outsider, like me. He said she had an accident. Connor closed his eyes for a moment. The mask of fury cracked, and for a fleeting instant, Abby saw a pain so deep, so raw, it cut her to the soul. It was the look of a boy who had lost his mother, not the Don who had lost control. When he opened his eyes again, the fury had been replaced by an infinite weariness. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled her into his arms. It wasn't a gentle embrace. It was desperate, possessive. He held her tight against his chest, one hand on her back, the other buried in her hair, holding her head to his shoulder as if he could shield her from the world by sheer force. She felt the tremor that ran through his body, the fight for control. He lied. Connor murmured into her hair, his voice rough. The accident. It wasn't an accident. It was Falcone, his father. They killed her because they couldn't get to me, couldn't get to my father. They killed her to break us. Abby sobbed, the sound muffled against his shoulder. The truth was 1,000 times worse than the insinuation. The story wasn't a warning. It was a direct threat. A playbook. He held her there for a long time, just breathing each other in, the only sound the frantic beats of their hearts beginning to slow in unison. Finally, he gently pushed her away, holding her by the shoulders, his eyes searching hers in the dim light of the room. I should never have brought you into this, he said, the guilt in his voice stark. I was selfish. I saw you and I wanted you, and I didn't think about the consequences. Did you think I wouldn't find out? She asked, her voice faint. No, he admitted, shaking his head. I think I just wanted to keep our worlds separate from mine for as long as I could. I wanted to give you the version of me that isn't covered in blood and secrets. The confrontation she'd been dreading was happening, but not in the way she'd expected. There were no denials, no anger directed at her. Just a brutal, painful honesty that laid them both bare. Why didn't you tell me about her? Abby whispered. About your mother? Shame, he said simply. Because for all my power, I couldn't protect her. And I've brought you into the same danger. Falcone didn't approach you by chance, Abby. He knows we're at war. And he did exactly what his father did. He went after the woman. He used you to send me a message. Abby pulled away from him, walking to the window and staring out at the city lights without really seeing them. Her mind was spinning. So he was right. I am your weakness. No, Connor said, his voice hard as steel from behind her. You are not my weakness. He came up behind her, stopping just short of touching her. She could feel the heat of his body, his solid presence at her back. Ever since my mother died, he said, his voice low and laden with an old pain, I have built walls around my heart. I became the man my father needed me to be. Cold, calculating, ruthless. I closed every door to emotion because emotion in my line of work is a liability. It gets you killed. He paused, and she felt his breath in her hair. And then I found you, and you kicked open a door I thought was locked forever. You remind me that there is beauty in the world, that there is something to fight for beyond power and territory. You don't make me weak, Abby. You make me stronger. You give me a reason. Tears were streaming silently down Abby's face. She turned to face him, the city lights silhouetting him. But at what cost, Connor? I'm scared. I know, he said, his expression softening. He lifted his hand and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was impossibly tender. You have every right to be. And if you tell me to walk away right now, I will. I will disappear from your life, and you will never have to worry about men like Silvio Falcone again. I'll make sure of it. The offer was there, the escape route she had craved moments before. A safe, normal, gray life. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the truth. If he left, he would close that door inside himself again. Maybe for good. He would go back to being the cold king of his shadow empire. And she would go back to being the lonely observer in a world that didn't excite her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, there was something else. A sense of loyalty to this man who had shown her his wounded soul. and a stubborn defiance against the man who had tried to use her as a pawn. "What if I don't want you to go?" she asked, her voice barely audible. A flicker of hope, so intense it was almost painful, ignited in Connor's eyes. "Then you have to understand," he said, his voice serious. "This changes everything. No more secret dates, no more hiding. If you stay, you stand with me. In the open, and that means you become a target. I can protect you, Abby. I would die to protect you. But I can't hide you from my world. Not anymore." It was a proposal, not of marriage, but of alliance. An invitation to step inside the fortress, not just the secret garden. Abby looked down at his hand, then back up at his face. She thought of her life before him safe, yes, but shaded in gray. With him, life was terrifying, but it was in vibrant color. She had tasted it, and she couldn't go back. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. His hand closed over hers, a firm, sure grip. A contract sealed. A deep breath escaped his lips, a sound of relief so profound it seemed to come from his soul. He pulled her to him, not with the desperation from before, but with a quiet reverence. He buried his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling her. "Mine," he whispered against her skin. It wasn't a statement of ownership, but of belonging. An acknowledgement that their fates were now irrevocably intertwined. She wrapped her arms around him, feeling his strength and warmth envelop her. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was now counterbalanced by something far more powerful. The certainty that, for better or for worse, she was no longer alone. The night after the confrontation didn't end in passion, but in a solemn quiet. It was as if the confession and the decision had drained all the energy from the room, leaving behind only a raw vulnerability. Connor didn't leave. He guided her to the sofa, sat beside her in the dark, and just held her. He didn't say much, but his presence was a steady anchor in Abby's emotional turmoil. She fell asleep leaning against his shoulder, his scent surrounding her, the steady rhythm of his breathing lulling her into a fitful sleep. When she woke, the first light of dawn was painting the sky gray, and she was in her own bed, tucked under the covers. For a moment, she thought it might have all been a nightmare. But then she saw him. Connor was sitting in an armchair in the corner of the room, fully dressed, watching her. He hadn't slept. He had stood guard all night. The sight of him there, a silent sentinel in her sanctuary, was both comforting and profoundly unsettling. It was a physical reminder that her life, as she knew it, was over. "Good morning," he said, his voice soft but rough from lack of sleep. She sat up, her heart heavy. "You didn't have to stay." "Yes, I did," he replied, with no room for argument. He stood and came to the side of the bed. The morning light cast long shadows across the floor, and he looked like a figure from another century. "Things are going to change fast, Abby. You need to be ready." And they did. The speed of the change was dizzying. The first change was her home. That very afternoon, 2 men arrived at her apartment. They were not movers. They were security professionals. With silent efficiency, they installed new locks, a state-of-the-art alarm system, and discreet cameras that covered every entrance to the building. Abby watched, feeling like a stranger in her own space. Her little haven was being turned into a safe house. The second change was her freedom. Connor assigned her a driver and a bodyguard. The bodyguard, a man named Leo, was about her age, with kind eyes but a body that looked like it was carved from stone. He was polite, unobtrusive, but his presence was constant. A trip to the grocery store, meeting Emma for coffee, even a simple walk in the park now involved the logistical planning of a military operation. Spontaneity was ripped from her life. Abby felt trapped in an invisible cage, the bars built from the intention of protecting her. The third and most difficult change was her job. "You can't work for Mrs. Davenport anymore," Connor told her that evening, his tone making it clear it was not a suggestion. "What? Connor, it's my job, it's my independence," she protested, panic rising in her throat. They were in his penthouse, a vast, minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows that displayed the city like a work of art. It was the first time he had brought her here. The place reeked of power and loneliness. Her independence makes her a soft target, he said, turning from the city panorama to face her. Her office, the events she attends, they're unsecure. Falcone knows where you work. He will use it. It's not safe. So what am I supposed to do? Sit in this ivory tower all day, waiting for you? The bitterness in her voice surprised her. Connor's expression softened. He came over and took her hands. His were warm and steady, enveloping her cold ones. No, I would never ask that of you. He led her to a large oak desk in the corner of the room. It was covered in art books and auction catalogs. You told me your dream was to be a curator. The Moretti Foundation owns one of the largest private art collections in the country. Much of it sits in storage, never seen. The foundation needs a new director, someone with a sharp eye and a passion for the art. Abby stared at him, stunned. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you your dream, he corrected gently. On your own terms. You would have your own office, your own staff. You would be inside the Moretti ecosystem, where I can guarantee your safety. But the work would be yours. The vision would be yours. It was a breathtaking offer. The chance to do what she had always loved, with unlimited resources. But it was also another cage. A gilded one, but a cage nonetheless. He wasn't just protecting her. He was absorbing her into his world, piece by piece, erasing the lines of her old life until only the life with him remained. She accepted. How could she not? The alternative was sitting in her fortified apartment, a prisoner waiting for a threat she might never see coming. Quitting her job with Mrs. Davenport was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. The woman was shocked, but to her credit, understanding. I always knew you were destined for bigger things, my dear, she said, giving Abby a surprisingly warm hug. As Abby cleared out her desk, putting her few personal belongings into a box, she felt a pang of grief. It was the end of a chapter. The end of Abby Parker, the assistant. She was stepping into a new, unknown world, one that came with luxury and danger in equal measure. And the danger was not slow to show its face again. A week after she started her new job, Connor took her to a family dinner. It was not a casual get-together. It was her formal introduction to the familia. The dinner was at Connor's uncle's estate, a sprawling mansion on Long Island that was more fortress than home. The air was heavy with tradition and unspoken power. Men in dark suits and women wearing quiet but expensive jewelry watched her with curious, assessing eyes. She shook hands with uncles, cousins, and capos whose smiles didn't reach their eyes. She felt the press of Connor's hand on her waist, a constant reminder of his protection. He guided her through the room with a regal ease, introducing her with a simplicity that was its own command. This is Abby. She's with me. The message was clear. She was untouchable. During dinner, seated beside Connor at the head of a long mahogany table, she felt as though she were on a stage. She listened to the conversations around her, a mix of Italian and English, discussions of legitimate businesses interwoven with innuendos and veiled references she didn't understand. It was a code, a language she didn't speak. It was then that one of Connor's cousins, a man named Marco, with sly eyes and too quick a smile, leaned across the table. So, Abby, he said, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. Connor tells us you're an art expert, a woman of culture. Tell us, do you find that blood mixes well with oil paint? A cold silence fell over the table. The question was a test, a veiled taunt. Before Abby could respond, Connor's hand landed on her thigh under the table, a firm, reassuring squeeze. He turned slowly to face his cousin. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marco, Connor said, his voice dangerously soft. The only mixing of blood you should be concerned with tonight is what will happen if you address another word to Abby that is not with the utmost respect. Marco's smile faltered. He visibly paled. It was just a joke, Cugino. I'm not laughing, Connor replied, his stare as hard as granite. The moment stretched, tense and uncomfortable. Finally, Marco lowered his eyes. My apologies, Abby. The dinner continued, but the lesson was learned by everyone at the table. Abby was not just a girlfriend. She was under the Don's protection, and to challenge her was to challenge him. Connor's display of power was absolute, but to Abby, it was a chilling reminder of the stakes. She wasn't just dating a man. She had entered a dynasty with its own rules, loyalties, and internal dangers. Later that night, on the drive back to the city, Abby was quiet in the car. Connor took her hand. "I'm sorry about that." "It's okay," she lied. "No, it's not," he said, turning to her in the darkness. "I exposed you to the wolves, but it was necessary. They needed to see. All of them. Falcone. My own men. They needed to understand that you are not a weak point. You are an extension of me. To hurt you is the same as declaring war on me." She looked at his profile against the passing lights. The weight of his words settled over her. He wasn't just protecting her. He was arming her, turning her from a target into a symbol of his own power. And she realized that to survive in this new world, she could no longer be the silent observer. She would have to learn to be a queen. Abby's transition into the life of a queen wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow, arduous process, like a bone setting after a fracture. She learned by observation, using the very skill Connor had identified in her on their first night. She watched the way Connor moved through his world, the economy of his words, the weight of his silence. She watched the deference in his men, the way they straightened when he entered a room, the way they avoided his direct gaze unless invited. Her work at the Moretti Foundation became her training ground. Initially, the staff treated her with a fearful politeness. She was the boss's girlfriend, a figure to be placated. But Abby refused to be a figurehead. She threw herself into the work with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including herself. She spent hours in the archives, her hands smudged with dust from long-forgotten crates, rediscovering masterpieces that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. She didn't give orders. She asked questions. She didn't demand respect. She earned it with her knowledge and her passion. She remembered every staff member's name, from the chief curator down to the security personnel. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift. The fear in their eyes was replaced by a genuine respect. They began to see her not as Connor Moretti's woman, but as the Foundation's director. And Abby, in turn, began to find a piece of herself she thought she had lost, the confident, capable woman who had been buried under years of assisting others. Connor watched her transformation with a quiet pride. He rarely interfered, giving her the space to build her own power within his empire. But he was always there, an unseen support. When a European art dealer tried to lowball her in a negotiation, a silent phone call from Connor ensured the man's next meeting with Abby was markedly more respectful. He was the hammer, allowing her to be the skilled hand that did the shaping. They were becoming a team. Amid the danger and politics of her new world, their intimacy deepened, becoming the calm center of the storm. Connor's penthouse, which had once seemed a cold and lonely space, became their refuge. Their nights were no longer about extravagant dinners or public displays, but about the simplicity of being together, away from watchful eyes. It was in the small things that she fell in love with him most. The way he'd kick off his shoes the moment he got home. The sound of his weary sigh revealing the weight he carried. How he always brought her a cup of tea, exactly as she liked it, without her ever having to ask. He, in turn, seemed to revel in the normality she brought to his life. He would watch her cook in his vast chef's kitchen, mesmerized by the organized chaos of her movements, a contrast to the rigid order of his own world. "No one's ever cooked for me here," he confessed one night, as he sat on the kitchen island, watching her chop vegetables. "What did you eat?" she asked, not looking up. "Whatever my chef prepared," he said. "It was food, fuel. With you, it's a home." The word hung in the air between them. Home. It was what they were building together. One brick at a time, in the middle of a war zone. The sexual tension that had simmered between them from the beginning finally reached its boiling point. It wasn't in a moment of overwhelming passion, but on a night of quiet vulnerability. He'd had a particularly hard day. She didn't know the details, but she saw it in his tense shoulders, in the hardness in his eyes that he couldn't quite hide. He was standing at the massive picture window, looking out at the city but not seeing it. Abby came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek on his back. She said nothing, just held him. She felt the muscles in his back slowly unclench under her touch. He turned in her arms, and the look in his eyes was one of such raw need it took her breath away. He held her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Stay with me tonight, Abby," he whispered. And it was more than a request for the night. It was a plea for a lifetime. "I'm not going anywhere," she answered, her voice steady. He kissed her, and this kiss was different from all the others. It was a release of all the tension, all the pain, all the fear they both carried. It was a kiss of surrender, not of defeat, but of giving oneself over to the other. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her to the bedroom. His bedroom was like the rest of the apartment, large, Spartan, and dominated by shades of gray and black. The only color came from the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing everything in a silver glow. A huge, low-slung bed was the focal point, an island in a sea of silent space. Connor placed her gently on the bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets cool against her back. He didn't rush. Instead, he knelt beside the bed, his eyes level with hers. That simple act of placing himself below her, of leveling himself with her, was a display of vulnerability that moved her deeply. In that moment, he was not the Don, the king of an empire. He was just a man, looking at the woman he loved with a need that was almost painful to witness. She was witnessing the real man, stripped of all his masks. In that moment, in the quiet of the night, with the city gleaming below, they were not the Don and his queen. They were just Connor and Abby, and that was all that mattered. The aftermath was as intimate as the act itself. They lay tangled in the sheets, their bodies gleaming faintly in the city light. Abby's heart was beating in a slow, contented rhythm, and for the first time since stepping into this dangerous world, she felt completely and unequivocally safe. Connor pulled her closer, his arm possessive around her head nestled in the curve of his shoulder. He kissed the top of her head, a gesture of pure affection. "I love you, Abby," he whispered into the silence. The words were not said lightly. Abby felt the weight and truth of them. They weren't the words of a man accustomed to expressing his emotions, but of a man who had finally found the words that mattered. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were happy tears. She leaned up and kissed him softly. "I love you too, Connor." A smile, genuine and relaxed, touched his lips. In that moment, with his defenses down and his heart open, he looked years younger. What followed wasn't a grand declaration, but a quiet confession. "I didn't know what this felt like," he said, his voice a low murmur. "To have someone, for real." "Now you do," she answered, tracing lazy circles on his chest. "You're not alone." The promise hung in the air, more binding than any vow. As they fell asleep in each other's arms, the city below kept its noisy vigil, oblivious to the peace that had been found in a penthouse high above its streets. But peace in Connor Moretti's world was a rare and fleeting commodity. While they slept, a phone buzzed on a table in another part of the penthouse. A message was received by one of his trusted men. It was a single photograph, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The photo showed Silvio Falcone stepping off a private jet at a small airport in Teterboro, New Jersey. Beside him, shaking his hand, was a man the Moretti family hadn't seen in over a decade. A distant relative, an exiled cousin named Luca, whose name was associated with betrayal and ruthless ambition. The war wasn't over. A new front, more dangerous and personal, was about to open. And the refuge Connor and Abby had just built would be the first thing the enemy would try to burn down. Chapter 9. The tranquility of the next morning was a cruel lie. Abby woke first, wrapped in Connor's warmth and the tangled sheets. For one blissful, sleepy moment, the world consisted only of the sound of his breathing and the soft light filtering through the windows. She felt changed, as if the night before had settled her into her own skin, solidifying her place not just in his life, but in her own heart. She turned to watch him sleep, his face relaxed and free of the tensions that usually marked it. It was a luxury, she realized, to see him like this, vulnerable and at peace. The soft buzz of a phone in another room was the first harbinger of the storm. Connor was awake instantly. There was no drowsiness, no disorientation. 1 second he was asleep. The next he was wide awake and focused, his body tensing. The transformation was so fast it startled Abby. The tender lover was gone, replaced by the dawn. "Don't move," he said to her, his voice already taking on the tone of command she knew. He slid out of bed, completely naked, and walked into the living area without hesitation. Abby sat up, pulling the sheet to her chin. The cool morning air suddenly felt hostile. She could hear the low murmur of Connor's voice, clipped and sharp, issuing orders in a mix of English and Italian. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Ice and steel. When he returned to the bedroom, he was pulling on a pair of sweatpants, his phone pressed to his ear. The peace in his face had been erased, replaced by a mask of cold, calculated fury. His eyes met hers over the phone, and his gaze was dark, distant. He was somewhere else, in his world of strategy and violence. He ended the call with a final curt, "Va bene," and tossed the phone onto the armchair. "What is it?" Abby asked, her heart beginning to pound. "Falcone," he said, the word tasting like poison on his lips. "He brought my cousin Luca back from Italy. Luca was exiled years ago for treason. If he's here, it means Falcone isn't just poking at me. He's making a play for control of the family, using a traitor with Moretti blood to try and undermine me from within." The mention of an internal war, a family betrayal, was somehow more terrifying than an outside threat. "What are you going to do?" she whispered. He turned to her, and the intensity in his stare made her hold her breath. "I'm going to end this. I'm going to tear Falcone and his family out by the roots, and I'm going to send my cousin back to whatever hell he belongs in." He came to the bed and knelt, taking her hands. His were warm, but hers were ice cold. "But this means things are going to get dangerous. More dangerous than before. I need you to listen to me, Abby. I need you to trust me no matter what." "I do," she said, and she meant it. "Leo will be with you at all times," he continued, his tone urgent. "You don't go anywhere without him. Your office at the foundation, it's secure. My penthouse is secure. But anywhere else, you need to be alert." The shift in atmosphere was palpable. Over the next few days, the penthouse transformed into a command center. Men in suits with serious faces and discreet weapons under their jackets came and went at all hours. Meetings were held in low, tense voices. Connor was at the center of it all, a general planning a war. He was ruthless, focused, and Abby watched him recede into the hard, cold place he needed to occupy to lead his men. He tried to shield her from the worst of it, always closing his office doors when meetings grew too intense. But she heard snippets, saw the maps of warehouses and transport routes spread across his desk. She saw the strain on the men's faces as they left. The war wasn't an abstraction. It was happening in real time on the streets of their city. Abby felt helpless, a spectator in a dangerous play. She threw herself into her work at the foundation, the one place where she felt she still had some control. But even there, the shadow of the war followed her. Leo, her silent bodyguard, was never more than a few feet away. The first direct strike came a week later. It wasn't against Connor, it was against her. She was leaving the foundation building at the end of the day, Leo at her side. The street was bustling with rush-hour traffic. As they walked toward the waiting car, a black sedan with dark windows screeched around the corner, accelerating directly toward them. It all happened in a blink. Leo reacted on pure instinct. "Down!" he yelled, shoving Abby behind him. He threw her to the pavement behind a parked car, just as the back window of the approaching sedan slid down. The sound of automatic gunfire ripped through the afternoon air, deafening and terrifying. Glass shattered. People screamed and ran for cover. Abby huddled on the asphalt, her heart hammering, the scent of cordite burning in her nostrils. She saw Leo standing over her, draw his own weapon, and return fire with a terrifying calm. The tires of the black sedan screeched as it sped away, disappearing into traffic. The silence that followed was almost as shocking as the noise. Sirens began to wail in the distance. "Are you okay? Were you hit?" Leo asked, his voice strained as he crouched beside her. Abby shook her head, unable to form words. She was trembling uncontrollably. She wasn't hurt, but the reality of the violence had hit her with full force. This wasn't a movie. These were real bullets. Death had missed her by inches. When Connor arrived on the scene, he looked as if he'd aged 10 years. His face was pale beneath his tan, a mask of fury and fear. He knelt beside her, ignoring the police and his own men, and wrapped her in his arms. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice cracking. "God, I'm so sorry." That night in the penthouse, Abby couldn't stop shaking. Every sound made her jump. Connor sat her on the sofa, wrapped a blanket around her, and handed her a glass of brandy. "That was a warning," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "They didn't mean to kill you. If they wanted you dead, you'd be dead. They wanted to show me they could get to you." Abby took a sip of the brandy, the liquid fire burning down her throat. She looked at Connor. The fear in his face had been replaced by an icy resolve that scared her more than the gunshots. His eyes were nearly black, his pupils dilated. "They made a mistake," he continued, speaking almost to himself. "They thought this would make me back down, that I would hide you, that I would become weak. But they don't understand. Coming after you, they haven't given me a weakness. They've given me a reason to burn their world to the ground." He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the night. "I was trying to play this game with a shred of rules, honor among thieves, but they crossed the line. Now, there are no more rules." Abby watched his tense back. She saw the darkness churning inside him, the brutality he usually kept leashed. The attack hadn't broken her, but it was threatening to break something inside him. It was threatening to unleash the monster. And she realized the greatest danger wasn't what Falcone and Luca could do to her, but what they could force Connor to become. She got up and went to him, placing a hand on his arm. The muscle beneath his shirt was hard as rock. "Connor," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Look at me." He turned, his eyes a vortex of fury. "Don't let them do this to you," she pleaded. "Don't let them turn you into a monster. That's not the man I fell in love with." Pain flickered in his eyes. "That man can't keep you safe." "Yes, he can," she insisted, cupping his face in her hands, forcing him to focus on her. "The man I fell in love with is smart, strategic. He's not a reckless animal. Don't win their war by losing yourself. Fight it your way. Fight it like the king you are, not the barbarian they want you to be." Her words reached him, cutting through the red haze of his rage. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath, his body trembling with the strain of containment. When he opened his eyes again, the murderous fury had receded, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "You're right," he said, his voice calm again. He pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "You're my anchor, Abby. You always bring me back." He held her for a moment, then pushed her away, his eyes now gleaming with purpose. "They wanted to send me a message by using you. Now, we're going to send one back." "We?" she asked, surprised. A dangerous smile touched his lips. "You're the director of the Moretti Foundation, aren't you? The public face of our legitimacy. And next week, the foundation is hosting its annual gala, the biggest social night of the season." His eyes locked with hers. "And everyone will be there, including Silvio Falcone." Understanding dawned on Abby. "You want me to face him." "I want you to stand by my side while we face him," he corrected. "No more hiding. No more being the target. That night, you will not be my weakness. You will be my weapon. We're going to show him, and everyone else, that the Moretti family is united and stronger than ever." Fear tried to claw at her, but she pushed it away. Connor's words had lit a fire inside her. No more being the victim. No more cowering in the shadows. It was time to stand up. It was time to become the queen he needed her to be. "All right," she said, her voice firm and clear. "Let's give them a show." The week leading up to the gala was the calm before the storm. On the outside, Abby was immersed in last-minute preparations, coordinating with caterers, reviewing guest lists, and ensuring every detail of the event was perfect. She moved with a calm and efficiency that impressed her staff, a queen commanding her first major event. But inside, a knot of anxiety was tied tight in her stomach. Every call she made, every email she sent, felt like a step toward a cliff's edge. Connor, for his part, was noticeably absent. He was moving in the shadows, orchestrating his own preparations for the night. He would kiss her in the morning before leaving for meetings she knew nothing about, and return late at night, the scent of cold ozone and the city on his clothes. There was a new intensity to him, a deadly calm that was more unsettling than his earlier rage. They were two generals preparing for the same battle on different fronts. On the night of the gala, the air in the penthouse was thick with electricity. Abby stood before the bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection. She had chosen a dress that was both armor and a statement. It was blood-red silk, cut in a simple, elegant silhouette that hugged her every curve. It wasn't flashy, but it commanded attention. Her hair was swept into a sleek chignon at the nape of her neck, and the only jewelry she wore was a pair of diamond earrings Connor had given her, which glittered like chips of ice. The woman in the mirror was someone she barely recognized, regal, confident, and dangerous. Connor walked into the room, already dressed in a flawless black tuxedo. He stopped in the doorway, and for a moment the Don's mask fell away, and she saw just the man, his gaze filled with awe and something akin to reverence. "You look like a queen," he said, his voice low. "I feel like I'm marching into battle," she answered honestly. He came to her, stopping behind her, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. He placed his hands on her bare shoulders, his possession firm and comforting. Every queen needs her king. He leaned in and kissed the sensitive skin just below her ear, a kiss that was both intimate and a promise of protection. "I will be with you every step. Just remember what I told you. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, trust me." The ballroom at the museum where the gala was held was stunning. Dark orchids, a nod to Connor's first gift to her, graced every table. Soft light from chandeliers reflected off the polished marble floor. It was packed with New York's elite, a sea of silk, jewels, and power. When Abby and Connor entered, a hush fell over the room. Every head turned. Their appearance together, so public, so undeniable, was the first move in the night's game. Connor placed his hand on the small of her back, guiding her through the room. He nodded at acquaintances, his smile polished, but his eyes were scanning the crowd, watchful, searching. Abby held her head high, her heart pounding but her face serene. She felt the stares, the whispers. She was the center of attention, the riddle of the night, the ordinary woman who had captured the king of the underworld. They saw him across the room. Silvio Falcone stood near the bar, nursing a glass of whiskey. Beside him was a younger man with the same cold eyes, but a swagger the older man lacked. Luca, the traitor. Connor didn't approach them. He played a smarter game. He guided Abby around the room, greeting people, laughing, proudly introducing her to mayors and CEOs. He was showing everyone that his life had not been disrupted, that Falcone's threat was insignificant. He was flaunting his normality, his strength, and beside him, Abby was the picture of grace and elegance, proof that she was not a frightened hostage, but a partner. Finally, when the moment was right, Falcone approached them, Luca in his wake. "Connor," Falcone said, his voice falsely cordial. "A lovely evening, and this must be Miss Parker, an even lovelier hostess." "Silvio," Connor replied, his tone icy. "I'm surprised to see you. I didn't realize you appreciated art. I thought your specialty was more demolition." The barb hit its mark. A flash of anger flared in Falcone's eyes before he controlled it. He turned to Abby, his smile oily. "You're a brave woman, my dear. To stand by a man whose empire is crumbling." Abby felt Connor's hand on her back tighten, but she placed her own hand over his, a silent signal. "I've got this." She looked directly into Falcone's cold eyes, refusing to be intimidated. "I think you're misinformed, Mr. Falcone," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying over the party's hum. "An empire built on loyalty doesn't crumble, it only grows stronger. Perhaps you should worry more about the foundations of your own, which seem to be built on betrayal and desperate alliances." Falcone's smile faltered. He hadn't expected her to fight back. It was then that Luca stepped forward. "You've got a clever mouth for an outsider," he sneered. "My cousin must like that. But in this world, clever mouths are often silenced." Suddenly, the main lights in the ballroom went out, plunging the room into semi-darkness, with only the emergency lights and the candles on the tables illuminating the scene. A murmur of alarm rippled through the crowd. In the confusion, Abby felt a grip on her arm. It wasn't Connor, it was Luca. He had grabbed her, pulling her away from Connor's side. "You're coming with me," he hissed in her ear. Panic, cold and familiar, threatened to choke her. But then, Connor's voice cut through the darkness, calm and lethally clear. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Cugino." The lights flashed back on as suddenly as they had gone out. But the scene had changed. The main exit of the ballroom was now blocked by 4 of Connor's men, including Leo. They stood, unmoving, their hands inside their jackets. They had moved into position in the dark, a perfectly executed trap. Luca froze, his hand still on Abby's arm. He looked around, realizing he was boxed in. Falcone, a few feet away, looked stunned. "What is this, Connor?" Falcone spat. "This," Connor said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward them, "is me taking out the trash." He didn't look at Falcone. His eyes were locked on Luca. "You made 2 mistakes, Luca. The first was coming back. The second was touching her." As Connor spoke, several men in tuxedos who had been scattered around the room as guests converged on Falcone, surrounding him. They were not Connor's men. They were Falcone's own, his capos. And at their head was Falcone's right-hand man, an older man named Antonio. Falcone looked at his men, then at Antonio, realization and betrayal dawning on his face. "Antonio, what are you doing?" Antonio did not look at his boss. He looked at Connor. "War is bad for business, Don Moretti," Antonio said, his voice respectful. "Silvio has become reckless. His actions against the Signorina," he paused, glancing at Abby, "were dishonorable. They put all of us at risk. The Familia has decided it is time for new leadership." It had happened behind the scenes, in the secret meetings Connor had been taking. He hadn't been planning a war. He'd been orchestrating a bloodless coup. He had exploited the cracks in Falcone's foundation, using his enemy's recklessness against him. Falcone was finished. His own men had turned on him. Connor's eyes finally settled on Luca, who still held Abby, his face pale with panic. "Let her go, Luca." Luca's hand trembled. For a moment, Abby thought he might do something stupid. But then, he shoved her toward Connor and tried to make a run for it. He didn't get far. Leo intercepted him with brutal efficiency, pinning him to the floor. Connor didn't even glance his way. He just reached out and pulled Abby to his side, wrapping an arm around her, checking that she was all right. "It's over," he whispered in her ear. The crowd of guests watched in stunned silence, witnessing the shift of power in real time. Falcone's men escorted him from the room, his reign ended. Connor's men took Luca away, his fate sealed. Antonio approached Connor, bowing his head. "The city is yours, Don Moretti." Connor just nodded. He turned to the crowd, his hand still firmly on Abby's waist. He raised his champagne glass. "Please, enjoy the party," he said, his voice calm and in control. "And thank you for supporting the Moretti Foundation." The music started up again, hesitantly. The war was over. Later that night, back at the penthouse, the adrenaline finally subsided. leaving a quiet exhaustion in its wake. Abby stood at the window, looking out at the city that had nearly broken her, but which now felt like her kingdom too. Connor came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood in silence for a long time. "You didn't tell me your plan," she said finally, not as an accusation, but an observation. "I couldn't," he replied. "I couldn't risk them seeing any hesitation in you. I needed your reaction to be real. Your courage tonight, your strength. That's what convinced Antonio I was right. That a man's strength isn't in his brutality, but in what he protects." She turned in his arms to face him. "We did it." "Yes," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. A genuine smile, free from the weight of the world for the first time. "We did." He kissed her, and this kiss was not about passion or need. It was about partnership, about survival. It was the kiss of a king and his queen, alone in their castle in the sky, having weathered the storm and come out the other side, together and stronger. Their story had begun with a masked kiss, a stolen encounter in the dark. And now, looking out at the city they had won, Abby knew she didn't need a mask anymore. She had found her true face, her true strength beside him. The fairy tale was dark and dangerous and complicated, but it was theirs, and it was just the beginning.